Welcome to today's Veritas Forum. Today we gather here in Turku to talk about the origin of the universe and God's place in this. My name is Benjamin Häggblom and I'm a theology student. I'm also the chairman of Studentmissionen in Turku. Veritas Forum Finland is a network that organizes academic discussions about the big questions of life on university campuses across Finland. We operate in Finnish, Swedish and English. The Veritas Forum events originated at Harvard University in 1992. Since then, over 200 universities in North America, Europe and Asia have hosted these events. In Finland, the events are coordinated by the Christian student organization Studentmissionen, OPCO, or IFES Finland. At this point, I would like to welcome and introduce our moderator for today. Today our moderator will be Anna Sell. Welcome.
Thank you.
Anna is a senior lecturer in information systems at Åbo Akademi University. She does research and teaching on how technology influences society, organizations, and everyday life. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. So welcome from my part as well. Glad to see all of you here. And so today, those who are discussing will be Dr. Peter Payne and Torbjörn Björkman, who is a senior lecturer in physics at Åbo Akademi University. Before we go to the actual discussion or debate, we'll see what it will be. There will be an introduction to cosmology by Dr. Payne. After that, both of the discussants will have first 12 minutes to tell of their views, then 5 minutes again, and if needed, we will give them 2 more minutes to address each other. But after that, it's time for questions and discussion. So please make note of your thoughts and questions that might arise while you're listening to the introductions. And then we will have some 40 minutes available to have a genuine good discussion. And a practical note, when you entered, I believe you have gotten a feedback form, and it's highly important that you fill it in and turn it in. So please, if you haven't gotten one, make sure you get one, and please fill it in so that we can continue developing these occasions to become even better. Now, I think it's time for Dr. Payne to take the stage. There you go.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I was asked to give a brief introduction to cosmology because unless you've studied cosmology, you can easily get lost. What in the world are they talking about? So this will be about a 5-minute sort of introduction to cosmology, so when it gets referred to, that you'll have some handles on that. Cosmology, by the way, is the study of the universe as a whole and also where the universe came from. The part of cosmology that's pretty well established is called the standard Big Bang theory. Starts off with saying that the universe arose out of a Big Bang, not space rising within space, but space and time itself arose 13.8 billion years ago. Within the first 3 minutes, the universe was hot enough that nuclear fusion was taking place. Hydrogen was fusing together to form helium, and the amount of that is about 3/4 hydrogen, 1/4 helium, and by the number of atoms, about 92% hydrogen atoms and 8% helium with just a little bit of lithium. So that's basically what the universe looked like, and even today, most of the universe is still hydrogen. At 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe was cool enough so the electrons could adhere to the protons for hydrogen and also for helium, and the universe became transparent, so light could then travel. And that energy has been traveling ever since, which we can actually see today. It's about 2.7 degrees Kelvin, just a little bit above absolute zero, but you actually see this background radiation even today. After that, galaxies and stars formed. Our particular solar system, it was formed after the initial set of stars. Ours is the second generation of stars because all the heavier elements within the planets were formed through supernova explosions. Some stars, if they're large enough, will collapse upon themselves and have enough energy to create all the heavier elements, and then it explodes, and those heavier elements get spread around through space. And as those collect together, you have planets like the Earth, which is mostly heavier elements, with a much smaller percentage of helium. Then later generation, ours is a later generation star. The Earth was formed about 4 billion years ago, and life arose here on Earth 3 billion years ago. As you can guess from this, my own view of science is very much aligned with the person I'm debating. So we're not differing on the science, but what does one make of it? Need to add at this point that in addition to the standard Big Bang theory is a view called inflation. In the very first fraction of a second, the whole universe expanded, space-time expanded to a distance far greater than our whole visible universe right now. Most physicists think inflation took place, but at the same time it's still hotly debated, and some very prominent physicists think that inflation is a bogus idea that never happened. I should add that of our universe, we now believe there's about 27% dark matter, 68% dark energy, and ordinary matter that we see in the stars and et cetera only makes up 5% of the total mass of our universe. Another thing that's important to note is the universe is expanding, it's getting larger, but the rate of expansion is actually increasing. So I'll come back to that in my own talk. Another development within the last few decades is what's called string theory, and a more recent development from string theory is called M theory, where our universe isn't just 3 spatial dimensions and a temporal dimension, but rather there are 9 spatial dimensions and a temporal dimension, or in M theory, there's 11 dimensions altogether. Question about origin of the universe is what caused the Big Bang? Now, if it was the beginning of time, one could say what explains why the Big Bang happened? And the short answer is we don't know. When you get down close to the moment of the Big Bang, we don't have a physics that's able to tell us what was taking place there. We don't currently have a quantum theory of gravity that people accept, so it's really, nobody knows what happened at the moment of the Big Bang. But there are different speculations that are given. One is to say that our Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, but it was a quantum fluctuation that just arose out of this nothingness, and the universe we see today came out that way. There's a book by Lawrence Krauss entitled A Universe from Nothing, with the subtitle is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. Another view is that the universe is cyclical, that it goes through cycles. Paul Steinhardt is a proponent of this. He thinks the universe will expand to where there is very little mass density left. At that point, what are called branes in M theory, he suggests will collide. And when they collide, you'll have another Big Bang, and that's been going on forever. So it's the eternal cycle of Big Bang and expansions in that way. There are other views that say the universe is in fact branching. One view by Lee Schmolin is that every black hole actually gives rise to a white hole, or a Big Bang on the opposite side of it. So we have a branching universe. Another view of a branching universe is built on what's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So where's the electron? It could be here, it could be here. The many worlds interpretation says it's both places and the universe is splitting. So you have all these quantum possible universes that are actually simultaneously real, and it's a branching universe. So that's a position that Stephen Hawking takes. Another view is called eternal inflation. So I mentioned that inflation expanded the universe from its beginning to a space far greater than our whole visible universe. Well, some people have speculated that the universe is eternally inflating, that it just keeps inflating. And there are bubbles within it which become like our universe, but most of the universe continues to inflate. And Andrei Lin, who's a Russian physicist, thinks that that's always happened. So the standard state of the universe, most of the universe, is continuous inflation, with just bubbles coming out of it. So I'll stop at that. That's to give you a brief introduction. Well, we'll get a little bit more of that when I come to my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. So now I give over to Torbjörn for your 12 minutes. I will be timing you.
So thank you. And thank you, Peter, for this nice introduction. I will have promised to start by confirming that this is indeed also my idea of the state of the field. And now what I am going to briefly do here is to now lay out why, well, this is supposed to be a debate, so I'm now going to take the position that I do not need a God to work with this. So the question is, why wouldn't I need that? Why don't I actually? Wouldn't it be simpler than all these theories to sort of introduce a God concept that sort of brings it into being? Well, perhaps, and this indeed I think could be a scientific statement. I see no problem with this. We can state this as yet another theory. I don't know why. Actually, I didn't know why didn't you put that there? But I here need to come briefly to asking the question: what is scientific? What is scientific and what is a scientific statement? Is it scientific to say that the force acting on something is equal to its mass times its acceleration? This would be Newton's second law. Is it scientific to say that the sky is blue? Is it scientific to say the sky is blue because of Rayleigh scattering? Is this a more scientific statement, perhaps? This is a statement you can often hear physicists say. Well, first we need to strip away language here. So I would argue that the statement "the sky is blue" is just as scientific as "the sky is blue because of Rayleigh scattering." We strip away these specialist terminologies, and I've just said something about the world. And how would I know if the sky is blue? Is the better question here. Well, the way to test if the sky is blue is, well, you can go out and take a photo, but then the question is, what is blue? We'll have to somehow figure out what blue is. And, well, I would make this easy on myself. I just gather a lot of people and ask what color is the sky, and they would presumably all say it's blue. And then when it turned out that 100 people out of 100 have said it's blue, then I'd be happy. But what was the point of that? Why did this make it scientific? Well, the scientific thing I did was I tested it. I had a statement, and I went out and I did a test, I did a measurement, and I checked whether it's true. In fact, this is something we're always, as scientists, expected to do. We're supposed to make statements that are testable. I'm saying testable here. It's preferably we want to put something in a lab and do a test again and again and again. This is not always possible. It's not, for instance, possible to put a black hole in a lab and do experiments on it, because black holes exist far out in the sky. But it is possible to look out at the sky surrounding us and look for black holes and look at what they do. In fact, this was fairly recently done. We've spotted gravitational waves for the first time, where there's a merger of two black holes. They seemed incredibly far-fetched that they found one such event just after turning on the machine. And it turns out that collisions between very, very, very heavy objects in the universe is apparently quite common, because I've seen several other ones since then. So we can do measurements, we can look out at the universe and check and see whether our theories hold. Now, the question here is, well, what has all this got to do with God? Well, to me it has to do with God in the sense that if we now were to add to Peter's list a mechanism in which a God starts this off somehow, then this would be, to be scientific, this needs to be testable. If you say there is a God, and you want to say that there is a God is a scientific statement, you have to. Then I say, very well. What experiments do you want me to perform to test the existence of this God? What precise thing in the night sky should I be looking at to verify this? Now, of course, unfortunately, on this list, there were a number of very, very different theories, and there are some of them which are, frankly, a bit far-fetched. I'm not a great fan of the many-world theory of quantum, many-world interpretation of quantum mechanics myself. And the reason for this is that in order to be able to get anywhere as physicists, we unfortunately have to indulge in the luxury of just going ahead a bit and see wherever our theories take us, and and not verify every single step. We have to go on and see what happens. But it is done under the assumption that we are going to aim for actually making verifiable, testable statements about reality. So the question of whether there is a God is ultimately one of, if you want it to be scientific, is one of testability. Now, what's the problem with the testable God? Well, so science is not so much a bunch of results. It's a process, I would argue. We aim to find out more, and what we find will constantly change. Now, part of what people think constitutes a God is something fairly static, I would argue, say. So, would you be able to accept a God that is this constantly changing thing? As we measure, this would constantly have to change. I wonder if that is a sort of God that most people would want. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. But fundamentally, why I do not think that I need one is, I guess, that we haven't needed one so far. We could come up with this list without the God, and we have gotten pretty far without a God. And wherever there has been a God previously put in, the God seems to have had to move on. And the fact that that God now comes on the list of things that happens at the edge of the universe, of the visible universe, because this is the same thing actually. When we look at this, when we look at the Big Bang, when we look at these 3.6 kelvins of background radiation that's there, we are looking very far back in time. But it's unfortunately as far back as we can look. As Peter said, we can look back at the point in time exactly when the universe became transparent. Because after that point, it's no longer transparent. We cannot see past that. It's opaque. So science without a God has taken us all the way back there. Now, I'm not really sure why I should think that I need one to go on from that point. Frankly, I'm quite skeptical about the possibility of finding out for sure what happens beyond that point, or happened, or happens. If it's cyclical, it might as well be happens, right? We can only hope. Our best hope is to be able to eliminate some of them. One reason for this is that it's very hard to do measurements on this. We are in this universe which we look at, but if we are to think of multiverses and multiple universes, well, it's not really going to be very easy to make measurements of the other universes, because we only have this one. We have only one data point, and it's hard to draw conclusions from that. But my reason for not thinking that I need a God to describe it is mostly that it has constantly turned out to be a God has been surplus to requirements every time we have tried to put in a God in our theories. It doesn't add anything that we cannot produce without one. And then we have an assumption. It seems like introducing an assumption that's simply not needed. And I prefer to avoid that, because I don't know what sort of additional restrictions this extra assumption puts in. I think that is roughly what I have to say within those 12 minutes.
Thank you, Torbjörn. Thank you. And Peter.
Yes.
Yes, your 12 minutes. Do you have slides? Yeah.
If I show up here, there we go. Okay, so I'm a Christian, and I believe the opening statement in the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The question is this in conflict with current cosmology? I want to make several notes here. One is that Genesis 1 actually says very little about the process. And God said and it was, and God said it was and it was. And Christians differ on what sort of process was involved, and also the length of time. I myself am quite comfortable with the Big Bang taking place 13.8 billion years ago. If beginning equal beginning of our universe, then Genesis 1 actually doesn't exclude the possibility of a multiverse. So I'm not completely closed to that. I'm not inclined to buy into a multiverse. But at the same time, being a person who's committed to what Scripture says, I don't think Scripture actually speaks of that. Genesis 1 clearly is poetry, and I think there are parts of it that are metaphor or literary devices, but it clearly affirms that God is a creator. Before I go on further, I want to say that my faith does not rest on sort of scientific arguments for the existence of God. I think that scientific arguments can actually lend credence and support to belief that God exists. But the Christian faith does not rest principally on cosmology or any scientific argument. It rests on the belief that God has actually acted in history. Last night I had a debate in which I argued that the success of science is not all opposed to God having acted in history. It's opposed to the idea that there are gaps within the order of nature. So the Christian faith rests on claims that God did these various things in the past. It does not rest on science, although science can come into the picture. My first thesis, I have some theses. The first thesis is that the Big Bang accords well with God as creator. In fact, when the Big Bang was first proposed, there were a number of people who were staunchly against it because it sounded too much like Genesis 1. Next, the origin of the universe remains a mystery for contemporary science. As I said, when you get back to asking what happened to the Big Bang, we don't know. There are speculations, but it remains a mystery today. My third thesis, which will take most of what I have to say, is that whether the universe, multiverse, had a beginning or has always existed, there are serious difficulties with supposing that science will show that there is no need for a divine creator. A fourth thesis is that the basic physical constants seem fine-tuned for the possibility of life, lending support to the hypothesis of a designer behind the universe or multiverse. I'll say a couple things about the fine-tuning. The basic physical constants are things like the strength of the force of gravity, your basic forces, the speed of light. And there are many scientists who have actually looked at those and said they seem fine-tuned for the possibility of life. So here's a quote from Stephen Hawking. The emergence of the complex structures capable of supporting intelligent observers seems to be very fragile. The laws of nature form a system that is extremely fine-tuned, and very little in physical law can be altered without destroying the possibility of the development of life as we know it. Were it not for a series of startling coincidences in the precise details of physical law, it seems humans and similar life forms would never have come into being. As you know, Stephen Hawking did not believe in God. His answer was, we live in a world where all quantum possible universes are actualized, they're real, and we can only exist in one of the extremely rare ones. So that's the explanation for why the universe seems fine-tuned. Well, we have to be in that very rare part of this vast multiverse that is compatible with our own existence. I want to note that not only is it pure speculation that all quantum possible universes are real, this would only explain the apparent fine-tuning if there is no fine-tuning in the ultimate physics behind the multiverse. So people like Stephen Hawking say there's a multiverse, nonetheless they believe there's a theory of physics that underlies the whole multiverse. And the question is it fine-tuned for the possibility of life? Having a multiverse doesn't guarantee that you'll have intelligent life or life developing anywhere. Okay, now my argument starts with this sort of two possibilities. One, the universe had a beginning, or two, the universe did not have a beginning. And by universe, I'm talking about the whole of physical reality, include a multiverse if it's there. Stephen Hawking has a proposal that actually doesn't quite fit into either one of those categories. So later on in the Q&A, if you want me to address that, I'll come back to Stephen Hawking's no boundary condition view of the universe. So what caused the Big Bang? Or given that if the Big Bang is the beginning of time, what explains the Big Bang? There is a book that came out in 2012 by physicist Lawrence Krauss entitled A Universe from Nothing, and the subtitle is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. Two points that he uses in developing this case. If you think of mass being separated from one another, that constitutes really a negative energy, sort of a negative gravitational energy to expand things apart. It takes energy, bringing that together, it releases energy. If you take the gravitational energy and all the mass and mass energy in the universe, there's a good argument to say they actually are very close to zero. So the total energy, when you add up everything in our universe, is zero. And if it's zero, then maybe you can have something happen just by chance from the beginning. It also builds on the fact that within physics, within empty space, you can have particle and antiparticle pairs pop into existence and out of existence. So it seems though you get something out of nothing. That's not quite nothing, it's empty space. And one problem with Krauss's view is that his nothing is not absolutely nothing. There's no space or time or matter or energy, but some quantum mechanic, some physics applies to it. And it's out of this reality that you get something. It's not absolutely nothing. Plus, there's the problem that quantum mechanics is probability-based. But what meaning can probability have when there is no space-time? As a philosopher, when you talk about probabilities, if you don't have probabilities, it seems like you don't have a quantum theory. So how can you talk about quantum theory when there is no space-time at all? Even if you introduce the idea of a space-time froth, where do these bubbles emerge from? Do they emerge from absolutely nothing? What undergirds quantum theories if you have no space-time at all? George Ellis, physicist on Krauss's book, writes, he gives no experimental or observational process whereby we could test these vivid speculations of the proposed universe generation mechanism. How indeed can you test what existed before the universe existed? You can't. There's the other possibility that the universe has always existed. There are two theories which are now no longer accepted because science has shown that they can't be right. One was called the steady state theory. Another one was the idea the universe is expanding, but it'll slow down, eventually come back, there'd be a big crunch, and maybe a big bang, big crunch. So both of those theories are out. The second one is out because we know the expansion rate of the universe is increasing. So it's not going to be drawn back together by gravity into a big crunch. That doesn't, however, mean that you can't have a cyclical universe. I mentioned Paul Steinhardt's view before, which is based on M theory, this 11-dimensional space. And within M theory, you not only have strings, you also have membranes, or branes, as they're sometimes called. And his view was the universe gets thin enough, these branes will collide, and you'll get a new universe, and it'll happen over and over again. So you get a new Big Bang, followed by expansion, another Big Bang. So he has a cyclical universe that way. A problem with it is in the second law of thermodynamics, entropy is always increasing. So in a measure of disorder in the universe, disorder is always increasing. So can you have a cyclical universe which is like a perpetual motion machine that just kind of keeps going, or is it wind down and lose energy? If it's winding down, then it can't be eternally taking place. Steinhardt proposes an explanation that says, well, gravity has this endless resource, that gravity can continue to be drawn on infinitely. Most physicists, actually I was talking to a string theorist about Steinhardt's view, said no, most people think Paul Steinhardt is wrong. The second law of thermodynamics is still a major problem for any cyclical view of the universe. Also, it's worth noting that when you have cycles, your basic physical constants may change from one to the next. But the second law of thermodynamics is not dependent upon the values of the physical constants. It's going to apply in any universe where there are more ways in which the universe can be disordered than ordered. So for branching universes, Lee Smolin has the idea that every black hole gives rise to another universe. Not very many people buy into that, so I'll just sort of step over that. Andre Lin has this notion of bubble universes and eternal inflation. So you imagine inflation expanding the universe out. Parts of it will stop inflating. But the contention is not all of this expansion will stop. And this part which is inflating will become far greater. Even if it's very improbable, only a very small part of it will not stop inflating. The part that continues to inflate will soon become much larger than the part that became a bubble. And you can have bubbles that keep appearing, but the universe continues to inflate. It's like bubbles inside a loaf of bread. The loaf of bread is infinitely expanding, but you get bubbles forming within it, but inflation has gone on forever. And he argues that you can have this go back forever. Some physicists say, no, you can't go back forever. Again, this is the second problem, the second law of thermodynamics. Why would each new bang start with low entropy? There's an explanation that Victor Stenger gives, but I'll pass over that for time's sake. Roger Penrose does a calculation on how likely it is for our universe to start off with low enough entropy to have the entropy level that we currently see today. And his calculation is this 1 over 10 to the 10th power to the 120th power, an absurdly small number. Roger Penrose does not believe in God, nor does he say, well, we live in an infinite universe, so of course that's going to happen. He says there must be some unknown law of physics which actually explains why Big Bangs start off with extremely low entropy. But the point of that is that we don't know. And for people to think that science is on the verge of having solved these problems, it hasn't. So the Christian claim of God as creator accords well with Big Bang cosmology. It is not incompatible with the multiverse. But multiverse speculation is speculation, and it may never be verifiable. Also, the apparent fine-tuning of basic physical constants accords well with the claim of God as creator and has added credence to the thinking that God actually created the universe as we see it. Thank you.
Yes, now we again give word to Torbjörn. Thank you, Peter. And I would like to remind you also to make notes of possible questions and thoughts you have. So When we come to the later sections, then you will be prepared to have a dialogue. Go ahead. 5 minutes.
Do I stand here or there?
Up to you. Maybe I think stand here because the microphone is.
Okay, thank you. And so my problem right now is to find the points of disagreement here, because this was after all supposed
We agree
to be
on a lot.
debate. Well, I agree on a lot. Yes. So the basic problem is, so I cannot as a serious scientist tell anyone, I think, to not put a God in there at the beginning of this universe. All these scientific theories have, as scientific theories do, their various problems. Myself, I'm leaning towards a sort of agnostic view of the whole thing. I think it began, and I have no idea why. And I don't think that it is a question that makes a lot of sense to ask why it began, because I don't think that it is possible to give it an answer. Now, suppose we do live in a quantum fluctuation. Well, how could we possibly know? We can only measure within this fluctuation that we then live in, and that is the totality of what information we have. Now, I do feel that there were some things you said that which is the physical constant values, which are remarkably good. Even though I do believe or suspect or whatever that the universe began at some point, I don't know the probability of this happening, but apparently it did. And I don't know how many other universes may have happened in other places with other values for them, but there's something called survivor bias, which is when you believe that something miraculous happened because you survived some accident or whatever. And this looks miraculous. Why should it have gone this way? Well, it did. And all people in a similar situation who did not survive clearly are not alive to think this thought. So only the people who survive will ever think it, and then it looks like something very improbable happens. Now, I would argue that the physical constant values argument is a case of universe-sized survivor bias. I mean, obviously we're standing here and discussing this, so obviously the values got the physical constant values got the values they have. I would also argue that I think that Stephen Hawking, is that right, is a little bit optimistic about his ability to be sure about what happens if he starts fiddling with those values, because those values are we only know what happens within physical theories for the values that we have. The physical laws, it's better to say model actually, because that's what they really are. We are building mathematical models of bits of reality. They work for the present values, and we don't actually know whether they would change if the values changed. We mostly think not, and for fairly good reasons, but we don't actually know. So,
1 minute.
So I still don't, so even if you assume a beginning, I don't really see a point where, for sure, I agree with you, science will never ever go past. I still do not quite see why there is a God there, and I don't quite buy the argument. And you also said something about God being inferred for the believer by God intervening and gaps in the order of nature. I would wonder how you test this, if this was a scientific statement.
Thank you. And we move directly to Peter for your 5 minutes.
Okay, I didn't list the God creating the universe as a scientific theory because I'm holding to a narrow view that a scientific theory is looking for a natural explanation. Actually, the many worlds interpretation is in a similar position to God creating the universe, because after all, it doesn't seem as though that will ever be testable. I've never heard anybody say in the near future we'll be able to know whether the many worlds interpretation is correct. So it seems to me that that's equally as philosophical and not a scientific position as the claim that God existed. Can one go for that? Well, when one is asking, well, how do I best explain the universe? Then one asks, well, what possibilities are there out there which will make sense to me? When you might say, well, I'm simply agnostic about it. Don't know how it came about. But I'm not sure that one can really be agnostic about the origin of the universe, because I think one will either think that there's something like God behind it, or one will believe that even though I don't know the answer, there must be a natural explanation for it. And maybe we'll never have the natural explanation for it, but there must be a natural explanation for it. Notice that is not a scientific claim, and that's not being agnostic. You're actually believing that nature can account for it without bringing God into it, so you're really not agnostic about it. The question was raised, how would you know what the universe is like, given that this is the only universe that we have? Actually, there's many reasons why you can ask what the universe would look like if the physical constants were different. Not if you changed all of them, then you'd have no idea what the universe was like. But if you keep all the physical constants the same but change one of them, you can do calculations. So it turns out if you change, say, the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force by a certain percentage point, you'd have no chemistry. And if you have no chemistry, it appears as though you have no complex structures, and hence you'd have no intelligent life. So there's a bunch of arguments like that that we quite reasonably think are necessary for life to exist. There has to be complexity. At the same time, there has to be stability. But there has to be enough change. When I did my dissertation, I had about a list of about 8 different things that have to be true if intelligent life is going to evolve in any kind of a universe. So it's the arguments that say those conditions are not met, which in fact undergird Stephen Hawking's claim that the universe appears to be fine-tuned. So you don't have to have other universes to be able to develop that kind of argument. I mentioned the God of the gaps earlier, and I think that the science tells us that when we look at the order of nature around us, we won't find any gaps that God fills by doing miracles. Something I didn't say at that point is I want to distinguish 2 kinds of miracles. What I call order of nature miracles, miracles that God needs to do to sustain the universe. And since I think there are no gaps, I think there are no order of nature miracles. All the miracles in the Bible are what I call specific point miracles. And those are miracles that God does at a specific point for a specific purpose. And yes, the question, can science address whether those have actually taken place? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, I don't think there's any scientific experiment that one can do to discover whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. And you can know exactly how the normal course of nature works, but not know whether God makes exceptions at times. So science really doesn't answer that. To answer that, one has to go case by case and say, well, how strong is this case? And how likely does it seem that there's a natural explanation for it? Is the case strong enough that I should reasonably conclude there's actually God behind it? In the Q&A, I could give an example of one where it actually is reasonable to believe that God is behind something that happened if it really happened. So that's why I think science is neutral with respect to it. When one asks, where did the universe come from, I don't think that one can truly be agnostic. When one asks where the universe came from, one is going to be inclined towards different views. Now, if one just has sort of this apparent fine-tuning, I don't think that by itself would convince me that God exists. After all, if you're jumping from a fine-tuned universe to believing in God, you're going from one kind of reality to God, which is a radically different kind of reality. And I think there's quite a bit of other reasons to believe that God exists. If you have other reasons to believe that God exists, and you look at contemporary cosmology, I think you can say, well, actually, what the Bible says makes very good sense about current cosmology. It's possible that we'll, say, have evidence at some point, indirect evidence for a multiverse. But at this point, even if there were a multiverse, that's not incompatible with what the Bible says about God as creator. So as I look at the statement in the Bible and compare it with contemporary cosmology, actually science is hard put to come up with an answer about what happened before the Big Bang, and it may never be able to answer that. After all, you could never do experiments on things outside of our physical universe. The only arguments you would have would be indirect ones, and I would maintain that the idea that God is the creator of this universe still makes very good sense with contemporary science. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like 2 minutes to address the last?
I would say a few words. I don't think it will take 2 minutes, but yes. So I would, since we are, in fact, I was suspecting that we would come to this point where we, in fact, are largely in agreement about the scientific ability to explain the universe and what we can expect science to deliver. Now, I think that you are free to fill the bit where we reasonably will never be able to go with anything you like. So I would, and since we are in that's where we stand now, I would just counter with saying I believe that it is possible to be agnostic. If as I started out saying here, you believe that science is not in fact a fixed set of facts. It's a process by which we learn more and more. And what I hope to achieve is not to learn what's behind that point. Even that is actually assuming that there is something behind that point. That's an assumption I don't need. What I do need in order to make scientific statements about this is to try to find out more about it. That's all that scientific method ever promises, is that we find out more. It doesn't promise you a final answer. Maybe there isn't a final answer. We don't know. It only promises to find out more. And if you are not content with that and comfortable with that, then you will probably need to find something else to fill out these bits with.
And would you like your 2 minutes?
Let me just say that I think you can be agnostic about it. Say we simply don't know. My suggestion was, is one assuming that there is some natural explanation, we just don't have it yet. And you may think we never have it. It is possible for a person to simply say, I don't know, and a person may be agnostic about whether God exists, in which case the person is genuinely agnostic about the origin of the universe. So I actually can take that kind of agnostic position. That's all.
Thank you. Okay, now you have heard two very interesting persons tell their views, and I'm sure they didn't tell all of their views. And now the floor is free for your questions, comments, thoughts. And we already have one. Would you please state who you are, and then if there is one of these gentlemen that you would like to address this question to. Go ahead. Do we have a microphone, or I'm not sure we need one. Yes. Thank you.
My name is Victor, and I study economics at University. I have a question to Torbjörn.
Yes.
This is regarding the Big Bang Theory. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from an article, and I want your thoughts. It goes like this. The second law of thermodynamics, also known as entropy, states generally that all matter has a natural tendency to move to disorder. However, for the Big Bang, the universe is promoted, the opposite thing would have happened. All matter would have moved towards order. This is impossible. What is the
Yes, I can restate it. So the statement is the universe that, as we see it, seems to be moving towards more order and not more disorder. This is, I think, wrong. It's actually, if you, because we must be very careful with what we actually mean by order here, and what is meant by order when you talk about the second law of thermodynamics. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without getting into the technicalities, but disorder is things moving towards the most likely distribution. Is the most likely distribution is getting things more and more disordered, but this is more or less just a statement that is its own definition in terms of mathematics used to describe it. We have the seeming, what we think of as order here is then the creation of lumps of matter like this in bits, circling bits of space and so on, that seems to have put themselves in a very organized fashion to us. But this is, it's still quite disordered, and you have to look at the number of all possible ways to organize all this matter, and not only the matter, you also need to organize all the radiation in the universe, and then you have also all the bits that were called dark matter and all the bits that are called dark energy that you need to organize in the most likely fashion. And given that we don't even know what dark matter is or dark energy is or where it sits, we don't see it, it's not really possible to say that, we are moving towards more order just by looking at what we see. For starters, we only look at some 5%, and those 5%, they are not quite as ordered as they might seem. But it's also tricky. But I would say that the statement is not necessarily correct. I believe we are actually probably moving towards more and more disorder, if you were to sum up all contributions to this disorder.
Can I add?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, part of the problem is people assume that the Big Bang started off without any order within it. It was sort of maximally disordered, got chaos. The question becomes, how is it that we get a universe which has low enough entropy to actually have the entropy level that we see today? There's a physicist, Victor Stenger, who says the universe started off at maximum entropy, but when inflation took place, that raised the ceiling of maximum entropy. And ever since then, we've been catching up to that. Roger Penrose, who I mentioned, makes reference to it, doesn't speak specifically of Victor Stenger, but says, no, that won't work. Even inflation still is going to have this great deal of disorder within it. And what's the chances of our universe starting off with low enough entropy to actually explain what we have right now? That's why it was 1 over 10 to the 10th to the 120th power. So even if one says his calculations there are off, there is a significant question of why it is that a universe could start off this way. And Stephen Hawking might say, well, it's possible. Anything statistically is possible. So even a very, very rare pieces of the universe with that kind of improbability, those could give rise to life where we know it. And that's true. But at the same time, I think that Roger Penrose is right in saying that appealing to that kind of improbability is probably wrong. He thinks there must be a better naturalistic explanation. I would say, if you think there must be a better naturalistic explanation, why should one exclude a theological explanation or bring God into it?
It's regarding this. If you bring in the second law of thermodynamics, then there is an additional complication, because that law can be a statement about entropy, yes, but it's also a statement about the nature of time. It gives time a certain direction. Now, this is basically the only law of nature that we have that provides. Well, the theory of relativity does similar things. It confines you in terms of the space-time where you can be, but it doesn't provide a direction itself. So it is a very special law, and given that physics, I mean, you may think these are big questions that we don't really know the answer to. There's an even bigger question, I would say. We don't really know what time is. It's not entirely clear to us what time really is, or why we can't move backwards in it or forwards. It's just this parameter that keeps going forward, and we know that in certain circumstances it will look different for different people who watch it, but exactly what time is, or if time in the second law of thermodynamics is the same time as in the special theory of relativity, this is also not entirely clear.
Yeah, Stephen Hawking, by the way, his unusual view is he thinks the direction of time is simply in our imagination. That he thinks there really is no arrow of time, and that the future, the present, and the past are all equally real. Now, most people don't agree with on that, but in terms of the mystery of time, that's the position he takes.
It's difficult. It is.
Would you like to comment or ask a follow-up question? No.
Yeah, one question. I know many Christians have the issue with the age of the universe when we say 13.8 billion years old. When we say it's 13.8 billion years old, do we assume the speed of light has been constant, or could it have changed and maybe it's not 13.8 billion years old? Are we assuming the...
Yes. So our calculations are based on the current values of the physical constants, and this is one other thing. This is a big assumption, and it's one we're making, and we believe in it largely because we can sort of backtrack and go and calculate backwards and arrive at something that looks like the things we see, and that's the justification for that.
Let me say that when you're looking at far distant galaxies, you're looking back in time. So if you're looking at some galaxy which is 10 billion years old, you can still analyze the light waves coming from it. And you can realize the hydrogen and helium are still there. So it appears as though, at least in that respect, the laws of physics are the same. If one says, well, maybe the speed of light was vastly different, one has to say that it was vastly different such that anywhere near us, we can't detect any difference. So it seems to me like a very arbitrary way of drawing a line to have the speed of light be much, much faster, and we have no justification. It does appear as though the universe, the speed of light was slightly faster, but only slightly faster, say 10 billion years ago. So there is some reason to think that's the case, but not enough to give, say, a young universe.
Thank you. Would you? No. Yes.
This is.
Yeah.
This is.
Go ahead. I think we can. Yeah.
I would like to ask Peter, because I kind of hear Torbjörn asking a question that I don't think you're answering.
Okay.
Maybe I'm wrong, but
Let's see.
Yeah.
So if you kind of agree on the scientific thing, and that kind of is out of the way, I hear he's asking, like, why put in God in the equation? And you yourself, Peter, said that you don't believe in God because of science. There are other reasons. So could you give some of these other reasons? Like, why put in God? You understand the...
Yeah. If you look at...
It's a wonderful question.
Right, if you look at the history of the Christian faith and of Judaism, Jews believed in God not because they didn't understand how meteorology works or how the weather system works. There's nothing in the Bible that says God is making natural processes, that He's miraculously sustaining them. Jews and Christians believe in God because God has acted in history. And that question is something that science is not able to directly address. For the Christian faith, the crucial argument is, a crucial miracle is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there's the incarnation, and there's no way you could test that at all. But you can actually ask the question, what about the case for the resurrection? How good is that? And there's two ways one can do that. One can develop the case by looking at facts that scholars would agree upon, and what explanation can best account for those facts. And actually, the Christian faith does very well in that, and it's very difficult to come up with a natural explanation that deals with these facts that scholars agree are there. But a person would say, okay, even if in terms of explanatory power, the idea that Christ rose from the dead is able to account for the facts very well, that can't be the right answer, because after all, dead people stay dead. And I grant, okay, yes, in terms of physics, dead people stay dead. But the question is, can God do a specific miracle to bring it about? So that raised the question, what does it take, rationally, reasonably, to believe that a miracle has actually taken place? When one looks at the evidence for the resurrection, one important factor is the earliest account we have is actually from Paul, and not from the Gospels. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, what we received, we passed on to you. Namely, he gives this account of the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. And the question is, when did Paul receive those? So we know shortly after his conversion, he went down to Jerusalem and he met with Peter and he met with James, the brother of Jesus. So it's quite clear that at that point he heard these reports of having seen Jesus. So given that was within 5 or 6 years of Jesus' death, then those aren't simply the product of legend. And most scholars agree that actually there were experiences that people must have had. Then the question becomes, how does one account for that? And that becomes difficult from a natural standpoint. But when it comes to the question, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? There's the historical question, the historical evidence question. But there's also the background belief question. Does the idea of God make any sense to you? And what does it take to actually believe that a miracle's happened?
Would you like to? Yeah?
I'd like to continue.
Yes?
But you of course you can. I'd like to ask, what changes in my life if I start believing in God? Not looking back, but looking forward. Why would I believe in God? Do you have I guess I'm more of an existentialist, meaning of life kind of person. I don't know if Torbjörn, but this is what interests me.
Yeah, I said earlier, I don't think there are any gaps in the order of nature. But does that mean that God never does sort of miracles or acts on us in a small way, but quite frequently? And I'm convinced that God actually does work in us quite frequently. That oftentimes when we have a thought, that's a thought that somehow comes from God. Now the question is, well, if God acts sort of guiding my thoughts, why doesn't he do obvious miracles more often? Part of my response to that is that obvious miracles throughout the biblical record are not all the time. They come at particular times and through particular individuals, whereas most of the biblical record doesn't have obvious miracles. But I do believe that God is at work in people's lives, whether it's through quantum indeterminacy, God making neurons fire that wouldn't have otherwise fired. It's quite clear to me from my own experience and other people's reports of things that happen to them that God is in fact at work. One example, just about 2 weeks before we left on this trip, there's friends of ours, a couple, they're both doctors, and they have a daughter who is pregnant. And the daughter went to the doctor, and the doctor did a scan of the baby and discovered that the baby had a terminal genetic disorder. And because they were doctors, they knew exactly what disorder the doctor was talking about. And yes, it's a disorder which is inevitably fatal. Well, they prayed fervently. A week later, they went back in again, and the baby was doing fine. Now, did a miracle take place? If you're inclined to think God doesn't exist, you would say, no, there must be some explanation. From a skeptical standpoint, one would say, well, surely the records got mixed up. But thinking about this story, if in fact the records got mixed up, I mean, the doctor will think that. The doctor said, okay, who is this unfortunate woman who has this very bad diagnosis? And I thought it was you, but it must be somebody else. But they didn't find someone else. So even though it's possible that there's some natural explanation for it, it doesn't prove that God exists. But when you have enough things like that happening, it gives us reason to believe that God actually does work in ordinary life and people's experiences.
Should I then?
If you want to.
Should I then answer the question why you should go away and stop believing in God and what changes?
Well, you should answer what you feel inclined to answer at this point. Yes.
Yes. So, well, I'm on the whole, disinclined to believe in miracles. I am, in cases like this, not least because I have, despite being a theorist, I have some insight in the tendency of experiments in chemical laboratories, which this is a question of sometimes get bungled. So, but that is of course not going to. I mean, that's an argument that obviously does not. To me, it simply seems infinitely more likely that this is the things like this is the consequence of known fallibilities of humans rather than the unknown infallibility of some other being, right? It seems more. This was a paraphrase of Richard Feynman said once. This seems more likely to me. If I may go back to the story of the universe, the problem is not so much that I can not think what goes behind our wall. Let's call it the wall, the background radiation, as far back as we can see. It's like a wall to us. It's opaque. My problem is not that I can't think what's behind it. My problem is rather that I can think of far too many things. There are so many possibilities, in particular if you allow things to shrink to a very, very, very high density, when we know that time and space start behaving rather oddly, if they go on behaving as general theory of relativity predicts, which is also a pretty well-tested theory in normal circumstances. Now, of course, well, when I say normal circumstances, I talk about things like black holes merging, which is not particularly normal for most of us, but there are other ways of testing that. In fact, your nice GPS signal gives you a very good determination of where you are due to the machinery accounting for the effects of general theory of relativity and the fact that the clocks we see the clocks as moving slower out in the satellites than they do down here on Earth. So what can happen if you shrink down the whole universe to something close to a point? Well, almost anything can happen. Anything is possible. That's why I simply don't go there. I can think of far too many things that can conceivably happen. Maybe that's a coward's way out, but it's a fairly functional one.
Okay, I see some hands. Let's go there to the back row, and then to you in the green shirt, and Victor, yes. But let's start at the back, if you would just also introduce yourself. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Torbjörn Björkman. I'm a physics student here at Åbo Akademi. Okay, I'm a bit nervous here, but I'm not used to this. But what I was thinking, how are you actually able to find if there is a God? So I'm also a Christian. I spent years of my life teaching people about Christ, but I also believe in science, and I believe it goes hand in hand as well. Now, I do not believe that you can find God through science, mainly because, well, you can find traces of His Word, but you can't really find Him, because it's hard to explain it, but I think it needs to be done in His terms, and not in our terms. So, if we want to find Him, so then we need to do as He asks us. So, but now this would be going into religion, so I don't know if you would actually, yes, but, so how we believe at least that we can find God is through having faith in Him. So faith is action and believing combined, as we can do in the Bible. And then it's act, so of course we need to believe in Him and then act according to what He teaches us in the Scriptures. And then we see the results. So to me, it's sort of like a scientific statement or experiment. So first you have a statement, so God states, okay, do this, and you test it, and then you observe the results. But for us humans, it's hard to act in faith, because it's usually very uncomfortable. You don't really know what will happen. But as you act and see the results, then you can, yes, then you actually see if it's true or not. And then also, I saw a video once about a scientist, I can't remember his name, but he said that science explains what happened and how it happened, and religion explains the who and the why. So it just explains it answers different questions, and that is why you cannot answer through science, is there a God? So that's why, that is my opinion, but I just wanted to say this because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I love physics, I love science, I read a lot about it, but also, yes, I do love God, I'm a Christian, and I believe it can go hand in hand.
Thank you.
I don't know, you can say your comments or whatever you want to say, but...
Well, I can comment. So I'll we are. What I didn't quite perhaps say here earlier, but it's if you have basically there are statements about science and there are statements about religion and what they are, and now I don't think that science will tell you any why. In the sense, in the sense of explaining how I mean, or if that on a greater scale why anything happens, because that is it's an unscientific question in that it presupposes that there even is a why. I think this why is something that we put there ourselves. We want there to be a reason. We are very keen on reasons for things to happen. And but of course I myself I must say when I do scientific work I want to find out that there is a reason for something and so on. It's very tempting to extrapolate this desire, for example, all the way back to the start of the universe. But I don't necessarily see that this makes, from a scientific point of view, any sense. You're presupposing that there is a reason, and this, I think, is from a scientific point of view, assuming too much. You are not even allowed to assume that there is a reason for it. Things just happen. You cannot, until you have gone and actually shown that there was a reason, that you are not allowed to assume that there is one. Most people are perhaps not comfortable with this making exceptions to the rule that everything happens for a reason, but when you dig into quantum mechanics, it turns out that you unfortunately have to make some exceptions to that in order to explain the experimental reality of that we see in labs. So this is my guiding light, and this is in a way convenient. It was very convenient here because it kind of separates things into things, the sort of why type of questions which are religious, and the other questions which are scientific, and so we can largely agree on things. And I do agree. I cannot rule out a God, for instance. So
yeah, why in English can simply be the same thing as how. You know, why did something happen? Why did my shirt get wet? Well, I left it out in the rain. So it's why is simply how did it happen? So if you think there's no purpose in the universe, then you can ask the why question, but there is no why because there's no purpose. So why sometimes implies a purpose, sometimes not. What's interesting in the apparent fine-tuning of basic physical constants, it is suggestive that there must be a purpose. It's just chance that we happen to have a theory of everything, ultimate physics, that somewhere gives rise to the right conditions that life can exist. So there, it's you actually have some reason for thinking there may be a purpose behind it because you have this apparent fine-tuning. In terms of ordinary experiences, if you were, say, the Apostle Paul, and you're heading towards Damascus to try to gather up Christians, and this voice from heaven and this light comes, and you're struck blind, you don't have to ask, well, what kind of God is this that could do this? How do I understand this God? I said, there's something beyond me, and it seems to be the God that I've been worshiping is somehow communicating with me now. And so one doesn't have to understand where it came from to say it's actually supernatural, that it's something beyond the natural realm. And when you infer God from things that happen, it's basically, can I infer some purpose that is within it? So in the case of people praying, and there's a seemingly miraculous healing, the question is, does this connection of the two actually indicate there was some purpose in what happened? But you have to have reason for believing that God has actually happened. If there's simply natural explanations for it, then I don't think that's a sufficient grounding for faith. There have to be things that happen that give you good reason to think it's actually more reasonable to believe that there's something beyond this world that actually was doing something for a purpose in this instance, and you can believe it because it doesn't seem as though any natural explanation can be given for it. So yes, we won't understand God. We shouldn't expect to understand God. But when you ask, why should I believe, it's not just faith. It's a matter of having things happen that are best explained or very reasonably explained by supposing there is some agent that has purposes.
Thank you. We have some 8 minutes, and I see quite some hands. So maybe let's see how far we get. Trying to be brief, maybe, because our time ends at 5, I suppose. But you in the green shirt, yes.
I'll try to be brief with it. My name is Nico, and my question concerns somewhat what you touched before. That could you, as a physicist, accept God when it comes to the origin of universe, for example, in this kind of cosmological argument, that we could you accept God as a inference to the best explanation when we combine the cosmological data concerning Big Bang, for example, and combined with philosophical arguments for the origin of universe. Let's say the age of time, we could prove it. If we could prove it, and arguments like Hilbert's Hotel, which prevent universe from existing beyond eternity to infinity. So would you if we combine these two, would you at least accept it as the best explanation that we currently have? Could it be possible like this? Not pushing, but just
and rather briefly.
Rather briefly. Well, my basic thought on that is that I cannot make a scientific statement about that. There's nothing. There's sort of I am more or less seeding the ground in the sense that put God there, put multiverses there, we are not able to test or really look at any of these. So a good scientist should not even discuss things that we cannot test. So it in a sense it doesn't matter. I put whatever you want there. To me it's perfectly acceptable to say I believe God started it. That is a perfectly acceptable statement. In fact, putting God there is very, very unproblematic, I think, for most scientists, because it's outside of the realm of the things that we can do. The debate would be a different one if we were actually discussing ongoing occurrences of miracles, but that's not the discussion we have today. So.
Thank you. And maybe a brief comment from you in the back that try to be brief to maybe and then you over there. Yeah.
So I just want to get it right. So this is a question for Torbjörn. So you said that asking the question why is not a scientific question. Did I understand you right?
Well, I mean, asking questions about things that we cannot, making statements that we cannot experimentally test is bad science. It's just bad science. And now, one problem that I was worrying that I would have to address more is that many scientists, unfortunately, engage in pretty bad science when it comes to this. They like to because we like to make statements about everything and so on. But there are if you cannot find a way of testing it, then it's.
Yeah, I would say the answer is science, in a more narrow definition of science, doesn't have purpose anywhere in it. Because that's how things happen, why things happen.
Yes.
But to assume there's any kind of purpose is really outside the scope of what science is looking for.
So I'm just thinking because of that, because if the question why would appear, if it's not a scientific kind of question, so why bringing it up? That's just what I was thinking, because the question did come up, like at least several people said that why should I believe in God? Or why do I need to believe in a God? But that was maybe I just did not understand the image.
Yeah, just let me say that there's lots of things which we believe that science is not able to address. We oftentimes make conclusions, inference to the best explanation, and science is unable to address those. Why should we make that kind of an inference when we don't know for certain? Well, there's practical consequences. Anytime there's practical consequences, we do act on things without certainty, and we go on beliefs if it's the best explanation we can come up with without science being able to address it. So if simply as the question, was there a creator of the universe, but it doesn't impact our lives at all, well, there's no reason to answer the question. But if in fact God is there and he's done more than simply create the universe, then there can be practical reason for why one should go beyond science and say, yes, God is there.
Or you could replace God with the multiverse in everything you said, and I mean that would make no difference.
If it didn't affect us at all, if it's just sort of a multiverse explanation of God, but doesn't affect us at all, then it's all hypothetical and out there in theory, and there's no real reason to draw any conclusion.
I think one more question or comment from you. Yeah.
My name is Ramis, and what I wanted to ask, maybe the question would be a bit controversial, but I'll try to ask it. So, let's imagine that somehow we have found the God. For example, the telescope caught a picture of the end of his beard, or something like that. Or even he appeared now in the auditorium and said, "Here I am. What's next?" Because about 2,000 years ago, God appeared in the shape of Jesus Christ. And what the mankind did, they killed him. So, do we need to try to explain God through the science or something like that?
Yeah, I think that science cannot observe God. Even when Moses sees sort of God passing by and he sees the backside. From a Jewish standpoint, God does not have a body. So all really God was doing is he was revealing his glory to Moses in the form of kind of like a person. But if you took a photograph of that, even if you could say there's something happened there, it wouldn't be picturing God because God doesn't have that. God is not a burning bush. So because God is not a physical object, there's no way science can accidentally sort of catch God at the corner of his beard or something like that.
Yes, I think we're trying to draw some lines in the sand here between what's religious and what is scientific, and yes, and I guess the question I'm often asking myself in these cases, which I might as well ask you, is it seems like you want to somehow define God as the sum of all our ignorance. Is this?
Yeah. It's oftentimes assumed that religion arises because you don't know how things happen, and now science is dispelling that ignorance. But actually, when one looks at Judaism and the Christian faith, there's nothing within Judaism and Christianity that says they believe what they believe because they don't understand how things work. It's rather they've observed things happening, and if those things actually happen, that becomes the reason why they believe. It's not a matter of ignorance. So if there's this light and this voice to Paul, St. Paul, it's not ignorance. He knows what's happened. It's true, it's an inference. He doesn't know that God is there. It's not based on ignorance. It's based on actual experiences, which I think when people assume that religion is based on ignorance, they have a hypothesis and then try to assume that Christianity and Judaism fit. But if you look at them, no, they don't fit that.
True. It's not necessarily so. Yet you say that you put God in this space where you say that we have questions that science cannot answer.
I'm saying that there are things that God does within history that science cannot answer. But I think science is not in a position to be able to answer that if in fact it's something from outside the universe causing it to happen. Science can study the effects, but science is never going to be able to connect the cause with the effects because the cause is outside of our universe.
Thank you, thank you. Now, of course, if there is something really important,
I think
you think yes. I wouldn't want someone to go out from here and keep it. No, because now our time here in the auditorium is up. I would like to thank both you, Peter, and Torbjörn for a very interesting, civilized, high-level discussion.
Boring.
No. I think the audience will be of the opinion that it wasn't boring. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience. Thank you for being here, and all of the volunteers and other people who have made it happen. Remember the feedback forms. Also, the videos will be available later on YouTube and via this veritasforum.fi website. And now I forgot to ask before, is it so that there are some Yes, there. Yes. At the back of the auditorium there are some refreshments, so if there is still something that is nagging you or you would like to continue the discussion, there is a possibility for this. So thank you again, and please find each other at the back with the, looks like coffee at least. So thank you.